My name is Madison Vaughn, and I'm an occupational therapy capstone student at Lincoln Memorial University. This is part two of my educational series called Caring with Confidence. Today I will be presenting Growing and Thriving, which is an NAS toolkit. I want to provide a roadmap of what will be covered in this presentation. I will be providing a brief overview of presentation one, just to remind ourselves of that information. I will also be discussing the impacts of prenatal substance exposure at different ages. I will talk about supports at these ages and stages using different strategies in the toolkit, and then I will provide some resources. I do want to put a reminder that I want to respect and keep a mindful balance between the stigma that surrounds a birth parent with a substance use disorder while also respecting the experiences of kinship caregivers. While completing this series, my goals are to improve the understanding of how prenatal substance exposure presents, caregivers' ability to recognize developmentally appropriate milestones, and improving caregiver confidence and understanding how prenatal substance exposure may affect an individual throughout their lifetime. Confidence does reduce stress, and lower caregiver stress can improve child outcomes. Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome, or NAS, occurs when an infant is exposed to substances in utero and then experiences withdrawals after birth. Just to give a recap of that definition. I will be using a toolkit approach in this presentation, and this is allowing me to further explain the lasting effects of NAS on the child's development and their life. I do want caregivers to be able to use the information and these strategies to reduce caregiver stress and support the child in their care. I talked in the previous session about the impacts of trauma on a child's development and how trauma is often co-occurring with other adverse childhood experiences. We do know that prenatal substance exposure does cause trauma to a child and therefore does have impacts throughout their life. This toolkit will also be used to understand the child's behavior and how prenatal substance exposure might show up in ways that seems like the child is being disobedient or acting out, but really the behavior is communicating something to us. So I want caregivers to focus instead of asking what's wrong with the child, asking what happened to the child. We talked in the previous session about how substance exposure leads to a variety of challenges and concerns for these individuals. This includes things like developmental delays, behavioral challenges, difficulty with memory, an increased chance of having anxiety or depression. It can cause changes in their body systems and particularly their sensory systems, which we will talk more about throughout this presentation. They might have trouble managing and regulating their emotions, and they have higher rates of stress on the body. It is important to emphasize that not every child with NAS will experience all these outcomes, nor will they look the same from child to child. Caregivers should understand that these challenges are related to neurological changes or brain changes, and it's not willful behavior. In infancy, prenatal substance exposure can lead to heightened stress and difficulty regulating and self-soothing. Infants with NAS may have trouble with things like feeding as a result, and they may have difficulty gaining or maintaining weight. They can be extremely irritable. They might have high-pitched cries that can last for hours. They need very calming environments, and even with some sensory supports in place, like low lighting, soothing music, quiet environments, they can still be unable to be soothed at times because their nervous systems are really working overtime. For some supports in infancy, as I just mentioned, some low stimulation environments can be one strategy used. This includes turning the lights down low, using soothing music, or maybe even a sound machine. You can try shushing the baby. Overall, just creating a very calming environment. Research shows that a light massage can also help improve growth and sleep patterns. Skin-to-skin contact is used to mimic the warmth that is felt in the womb and supports that bonding and regulation as well. There are different feeding supports that can be used. There are different nipple sizes, which can actually change the flow of the feed, which I included a picture of on this slide. Infants with NAS may experience more fatigue while they're engaging in their feedings, which would require a nipple with a slower flow, for example. They may also experience reflux or spit up a lot, so the different flow rates may help them have more control and avoid things like choking or coughing. It can also help with their pattern with swallowing and breathing. In toddlerhood, emotional regulation really becomes a primary concern. You may see sensory seeking or sensory avoiding behaviors. You might see delayed language skills or difficulty sleeping. At this stage, behavior is often reflecting those unmet sensory or emotional needs. There are different supports that can be used in toddlerhood for children with NAS. Visual schedules are a great way to increase that predictability for these individuals. A visual schedule is a series of pictures that are used to represent those ordered tasks or steps within an activity, and they can be made up of any number of steps from just a few to really several detailed steps. I included a picture of a morning routine on this slide. Children are able to check the schedule and it can reduce the amount of times the caregiver has to prompt them, which really helps with promoting their self-efficiency as well. They can also see what comes next, which helps with that predictability and transitioning to activities. It helps with what we call executive functioning or those higher level skills. So that can be things like planning, organizing, and staying focused on one task or what we call task persistence. You can also use heavy work for these individuals like pushing, pulling, or carrying, and this provides what we call proprioceptive input that is really calming the nervous system down. Proprioceptive input occurs when the receptors in our muscles and our joints are being stimulated by that active movement and deep pressure. Using simple and direct language is also encouraging for these individuals and supports their comprehension. We talked about early intervention services in the previous presentation and how and who to be in contact with about early intervention services. We do know that the quicker children receive services, the better their outlook for success. So it's really important for kinship caregivers to be acting as advocates for this group. You do not need a referral for early intervention services. I'm going to go through some caregiver tips for caring for children with NAS. I do think it's really important to mention that behavior is communication. So, co-regulation is really key for this group. Children kind of borrow our calm. So, I like this analogy of a teacup. And the way it goes is imagine you are holding a cup of tea and someone runs into you and it spills. Why did you spill your tea? And a lot of people would say because someone ran into them. And yes, that is true. However, you spilled the tea because the tea was in your cup. So I really like this analogy because it dives into what you are filling your cup with is what's going to come out. So if we're filling our cup with love and patience and graciousness for ourselves and for the children we're caring for, that's what's going to come out maybe in some more difficult situations. So caregivers must prioritize their regulation first in order to support the child. During the preschool and school age stage, so this would be looking at 3 to 8 years old, this is when attention difficulties, impulsivity, that emotional dysregulation, and challenges with transitions really become more noticeable because school demands are really increasing, and because of that, the stress is increasing with it. So we may see difficulty with transitioning between activities during the school day, or children will become really hyperfixated on one activity and struggle when having to move to something else, and this is what we call perseveration. In order to counteract some of that impulsivity, I did include some phrases where you can replace these as kinship caregivers when giving directions because it's really important that you're providing those clear directions and also offering replacement behavior. So when we say things like stop running, for example, all the kids hear is run. So we should avoid giving commands like this. Instead, we can say use walking feet or let's try something else. Instead of no biting, we may say things like we only bite food. There are different supports available for preschool and school age children with NAS. Frequent rest breaks for this age group can really help with that overload and overstimulation that's happening to their nervous systems. There are flexible seating options that can help support sensory needs as well. I've included some different seating options in a picture here, but I also wanted to mention some that caregivers might already have at home. So this could be like a beanbag chair, maybe if you have a soft part on the couch, if you have a bar stool, if you have a desk chair that spins, a rocking chair is another great option, or even sitting on a pillow. Social stories are another great way to prepare children for daily tasks and expectations. So, social stories are usually used to help teach socially acceptable behaviors and calm down techniques. I've also used them in the clinic before for talking about how to build social skills when talking to friends on the playground and even using the bathroom. There are clear expectations that need to be presented to children with NAS, and this helps with reducing their anxiety and confusion. And something else I like is what we call our comfortable wait time, which is something I learned from a clinical educator. But if I ask a child to go grab something from another room, for example, like a cup, if I tell them to go put their shoes on in another room, I'm deciding what my comfortable wait time is, which is how long I'm comfortable waiting for them to problem solve the task on their own. So if I tell someone, go put on your shoes in your room, I might decide my comfortable wait time is 3 minutes. I'll give them the 3 minutes, see if they can find their shoes, put them on by themselves. If after the 3 minutes they still haven't returned, that's whenever I'm going in and helping them with that problem solving. So it's really important that we are building skills and not punishing those deficits. In adolescence, we may see increased emotional dysregulation in individuals with NAS. We see higher risk-taking behavior and increased mental health challenges. And autonomy is really critical for this age group, so we have to let them be a part of our decision making. We do know that teens are at a very impressionable age, so trying to decide what is age appropriate can be difficult. They are in the stage that the German American developmental psychologist named Eric Erikson called identity versus role confusion. So he thought that our personalities develop in 8 stages across our life, and at each stage, we are focusing on resolving a conflict. So I want to emphasize that the teens are trying to figure out who they are, what they believe in, and what they want to do with their lives. They may be spending less time with the caregiver and more time with their friends as part of figuring out their identity. They might also be engaging in more arguing and lying and questioning the caregiver or the world. It is important to let them know that there needs to be some sort of mutual respect. So, you, as a caregiver, are providing their basic needs, so this can be like a place to live, you're feeding them, you're nurturing them. As caregivers, that is really what is expected of you. We do have this hierarchy of needs, and it is your job to fulfill those basic requirements for them. However, they do need to understand that it is a privilege to have things outside of their basic needs. So, while every kid does need to socialize as part of healthy development, there are certain expectations that are accompanied by that. So, for instance, you might say, yes, you can hang out with your friends, but this is your curfew, and I'd also like you to let me know when you get there. So, it's really about creating those boundaries and expectations for them. Some other important tips for teens, it's really important to avoid negotiating punishments, but also making sure that their punishment fits their wrongdoing. So you can still teach them consequences without feeling like you have to have these big, drawn out arguments every time. It's also important as the caregiver to remain in calm control. So if you start yelling, immediately their body might start going into that fight or flight response. This is where we also start to see some increased lying, and that's really acting as a defensive mechanism for them. So lying often occurs in order to prevent damaging a relationship. The teen's nervous system might not be regulated. So we also see them lose access to that upstairs brain, or what is responsible for that thinking, reasoning, planning, and problem solving. And instead they become very reactive and defensive, and they will do whatever it takes at that point to make their body feel safe. We do need to let them know why their behavior was unacceptable. So you may say things like coming home late caused me anxiety, or you lying damages my trust and you will have to work to earn it back. It's also important to be planting seeds of positivity or giving them something positive to hold on to. So, making sure you recognize when they are doing something right, even if it feels like a bit of overkill or feels like a forced compliment to you. It's also important to explain to them that everyone has rules, but also recognize everyone lies and everyone has their own way of figuring out what is motivating to them and what will resonate in terms of actually fearing consequences. So, we do have to have that buy-in from teens with motivating them to want to learn and want to engage in positive coping strategies or behaviors. And the same goes for consequences. I will now be providing some toolkit strategies. The first one I will be introducing is called regulation before expectation. And if our nervous system is dysregulated, our brain cannot access reasoning or learning, or that upstairs brain, as I mentioned before. Only after their calm is restored can we actually teach them to problem solve, or we can actually apply those consequences. Research shows that when we feel more in control, we are able to adjust better to those stressful environments. So we must help the child calm their body. We can do this with some grounding techniques, such as the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method, which is where you name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, and 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. I do want to emphasize that regulation is a priority, but it does not excuse discipline strategies. Once the child is regulated, then we can work on that teaching, that problem solving, and those fair consequences. This is really a trauma-informed approach that is prioritizing that connection and co-regulation versus discipline when the child is dysregulated. They cannot be in survival mode and learning mode at the same time. So this strategy is encouraging the caregiver to look at the challenging behavior as a sign that the child is struggling to manage their emotions and then help them move forward towards that self-regulation. Some other strategies to achieve that regulation include weighted blankets, deep pressure, so you can do things like arm squeezes, using an ice pack or wet washcloth, and because some children become really hot when they're dysregulated, you can also use things like a rocking chair, fidgets or chewies or sensory toys. Another toolkit strategy is what we call the stress bucket. And the stress bucket model is a visual coping tool representing your stress capacity as a caregiver. And it's showing your stress capacity as a bucket. So there's different stressors like maybe work or finances or relationships with the child that are filling up the bucket. When it overflows, you really may become overwhelmed. And to manage that stress, you use the taps, which are those healthy coping strategies in order to drain the bucket. So the bucket is representing your capacity to hold stress, so everyone's will be a different size. The water is representing those daily stressors, anxieties, and demands. And the overflow happens, which is representing the physical or mental health issues. In this case, it might be things like anxiety, irritability, or frustration. The taps represent those coping strategies that release the pressure. In order to use the stress bucket, you need to prevent your bucket from overflowing. So you either need to reduce the amount of water coming in, which is those stressors, or open the taps, which are those coping strategies. It's important to identify stressors, so you may want to list what is filling your bucket. So if work is causing you stress, maybe it's family, finances, or things like health issues. It's important to identify the taps, which are those coping strategies. So determine which strategies actually help you feel better and which drain your stress. You also can create new taps if your current coping methods aren't enough. You can add new ones you like. For example, you might try practicing mindfulness techniques. You might limit your social media, or you might need to set better boundaries. It's also important to be proactive and recognize early signs that your bucket is starting to fill up. So you want to really take action before it overflows. I will now go through some different strategies by age. So maybe you're following all these strategies already and you still feel like, okay, I've tried these and nothing else is working. So not all children are developing the same or are going to have the same needs. So take what works for you and leave what doesn't. So we're really trying to focus on how do we get a kid to want to learn and respond to discipline when they haven't been listening to any of the other strategies. In infancy, the focus is really on protection because infants are not old enough to consciously make an effort to correct their actions, of course. They're still learning about their environment. So maybe towards the start of one, they will begin to mimic your actions, but the focus is really providing protection and ensuring their basic needs are being met. They really need nurturing at this age. For toddlers, they may be at the age where they are really starting to test boundaries. They might be back talking or telling the caregiver no. They might even be biting at this stage. They have really big feelings, but they don't necessarily have the words to communicate those feelings yet. So you might try something like a feelings wheel and have them name their feeling. You can use a face chart for this. You might also teach them things like safe hands when upset. So you can tell them things like your hands can go in your lap or your hands can smack a pillow, but safe hands cannot smack me and safe hands cannot smack yourself. Grounding techniques might also be beneficial for this age group. And preschool age, they're now at the age where everything is why, because they are really starting to understand cause and effect. It is important to reward behavior at this age, but also acknowledge consequences for bad behavior. You may really have to repeat yourself a lot with this age group. The first time they're not necessarily looking for an answer when they're asking you those why questions, they just want to know that you have an answer at all. For school age children, it's important to start having those meaningful conversations and to avoid those power struggles. So instead of saying things like, I am your grandma or your parent or your authoritative figure, you have to listen to me, this is not going to be beneficial, but rather give them time to reflect on how they're feeling. So asking them things like, how did it make you feel when you lied? Or how did it make you feel when I caught you in the lie? And also just recognizing as a caregiver, I could have done XYZ differently, and then asking the child, what do you think you could have done differently? So you're really emphasizing that consequences do not always equal punishment, but rather you're trying to teach them respect and boundaries and teaching them cause and effect. For teenagers, they might be looking for attention at this age as they're figuring out their identity a lot of the time. So it's important to set and keep clear boundaries for this age group and keep that line of communication open. Some additional resources I've included are the numbers for Ohio Kinship and Adoption Navigator or Ohio CAN, the NAMI helpline, and the SAMHSA 24-hour helpline. These are my references.